Welcome back. We are in step 11, and in this step we'll take a small pause to take in the big picture of the architecture of web applications. So we'll take a high level picture of how web applications are typically developed. Whatever you are seeing on the screens are the typical layers in a typical Java EE application. You have a web layer, you have a business layer, you have a data layer, and you have an integration layer. Typically applications either get the data from the database. To talk to the database, we use a data layer. We talk to other applications. Let's say we are managing to-dos, not in our own database, but we want to talk to a to-do management like Wunderlist. In that kind of a situation, I would need to talk to the services which are offered by that to-do management application. Let's say I want to get the current values of currency or stock values. I need to integrate with other systems. So the integration layer helps me to integrate with other systems. The business layer in any typical application would be the one which has all the business logic for that specific application. So it would talk to the data layer, it would talk to the integration layer, get all the data it needs, calculate stuff around that, and have all the business logic in here. So these are typically the important background layer. Once you have the business logic, you would want to actually expose either web services on top of them, or you would want to have applications using them. Either you are showing them in a web application on a screen, or you are exposing REST services or SOAP services out to the outside world. All that kind of logic typically is in the web layer. So the web layer is the one which exposes all the business logic that you have to the outside world. In the MVC, M stands for modal, which is the business. So M is business, and everything beyond this stands for M. And V is view, which is the JSPs as far as we are concerned right now. And C is the controller. The V and the C of the MVC are typically in the web layer. That's kind of the typical architecture of any Java EE application. If we look at the typical framework choices in the web applications, Servlet JSPs is one of the basic ways of developing web applications. I doubt if anybody uses direct servlets today. Most of the applications use a MVC framework of the kind of struts or Spring MVC. Spring MVC is quite the most popular MVC framework, and that is what we are using in this specific application as well. As far as the view is concerned, you have multiple options. You have JSPs, EL, JSTL. So EL and JSTL make it easy to display data, do binding and stuff in a JSP. The other options are FreeMarker and Velocity templates, and JSF. So these are kind of the options in the for the view, and you are exposing RESTful web services which are consumed from AngularJS. So those are typically the things which typically are exposed from a web layer of a typical web application. Let's dig further into the Model 1 and the Model 2 architectures which are popular in the web layer. The Model 1 architecture is basically from the browser you send the request directly to a JSP. Right now what we are doing is from the browser we are sending it to the controller, and the controller sends it to the JSP. Model 1 was one of the first architectures for web applications where from the browser the request directly was sent to the JSP. So it was not sent to the controller, but it was sent directly to the JSP. So the request went to the JSP. JSP handles that request and it would redirect to the next JSP. There were no concept of a servlet then. So all that we had was JSP pages. This was one of the first architectures which was used to developing web applications. Obviously, these have a lot of problems because JSPs become huge. So JSP has all the controller logic, all the view logic, and over a period of time also a lot of business logic, and these applications became unmaintainable. And from there came in the Model 2 architecture. The Model 2 architecture, from the browser, the request goes to the servlet. So from the browser, like when user submits a request on the browser, the request goes to the servlet. The servlet would talk to the business logic, would finalize the model and make it available to the view. And then the view would be rendered to the browser. And the next request from the browser might go to a different servlet. With this kind of an architecture, we had a lot of popular frameworks come in, like Struts, for example. Struts 1 had this Model 2 architecture. From the browser, you redirected the request directly to the servlets which are on the server. Model 2 friend controller architecture is an evolution on top of the Model 2 architecture. So from the browser, we always send a request to a single controller. This controller is called a friend controller. For example, in Spring MVC, this is called dispatcher servlet. So dispatcher servlet is nothing but a friend controller. So what happens is all requests go to the friend controller. So whether you are sending a /login request or a /list to do request, it will always go first to the dispatcher servlet. And from dispatcher servlet, the dispatcher servlet says, okay, /login, login controller, /list to do controller, or to do controller. Based on the URL, the front controller decides which controller to go to. Once controller returns the data back, it decides which view to render, and it would send the response back to the browser. Front controller, so all data would be going through the front controller in a Model 2 architecture with front controller. Typically, this is the most famous architecture with MVC applications. The reason is like front controller becomes the central point of the entire application, so you can implement things like security and all that kind of stuff at single place. So if I want to log every request, I can add it to the front controller. If I want to implement security around all the URLs, I can do that in the front controller. So all the centralized logic, I can start implementing it in the front controller. The idea behind this step was to give you an overview of typical architecture of Java web applications. While we want to get our hands dirty, it's very important for you to get the big picture of how things are organized. So we looked at the different layers in a typical web application: web, business, data, and integration. We looked at the different framework choices that are available in a web layer. We looked at the Model 1 architecture where there were only JSPs and JSPs became huge. And then we looked at Model 2 architecture where the request directly went to different servlets at different points in time. And the last thing which we looked at was Model 2 with front controller, where all the requests from the browser first go to a front controller, and front controller then decides which controller to call. In the next step, we would start getting our hands dirty again. Until then, bye-bye.